Okay, hello everyone. We are going to explore the ribs and the rib cage in this lecture. I'm going to assume that you have studied the vertebra. It can be a little difficult describing the ribs without a previous study of the vertebra, because ribs do anchor to the vertebra. So let's look at that real quick. Here is the rib cage. And the position that it sits on is because of the ribs being anchored to the vertebra. The vertebral column, you'll remember, is in three basic sections up above: the cervical vertebra, the thoracic, and the lumbar vertebra. And it is the thoracic vertebra that are the ones that have ribs attached to them. There are 12 thoracic vertebrae, and there are 12 pairs of ribs running down. So if you look through the rib cage here, you can see the ribs are attached into those thoracic vertebrae. And there's two little synovial joints in the back for each rib. So we're going to explore those attachments in just a little bit. The ribs then sweep around to the front and they anchor onto the sternum. They either do or they don't. There's a couple of ribs that don't attach to the sternum, but the majority of them do. Because of that, the ribs here in the rib cage are grouped into three groups: ones that attach directly to the sternum, ones that attach indirectly to the sternum, and a couple of ribs at the bottom that don't attach to the sternum at all. So there are three types of ribs in the rib cage, and each group has a name. The first ribs are the ones, sometimes called true ribs, are the ones that attach directly to the sternum. So if you look at this rib cage, you can see the ribs are numbered. If you would move down the rib cage, find the last rib who actually sweeps over and touches or attaches to the sternum. That would be rib number 7. Everybody see that? And remember, too, that the ribs don't attach directly. In other words, they do not touch the sternum. They attach through a little piece of cartilage. These are cartilaginous joints here. So ribs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are known more exactly as vertebrosternal ribs. Notice that the name tells you they attach from the vertebra directly to the sternum. That's ribs 1 through 7. Color those in for you. So sometimes called true ribs, but of course don't use that here. You want to be more exact. Make sure if I ask you what one of these ribs are that you tell me it's vertebrosternal. Now the next three ribs, ribs 8, 9, and 10, if you look at those, you'll see that those three ribs do not attach to the sternum. Look at rib number 8 for a moment. Its cartilage sweeps up and attaches to the cartilage of 7, and 9's cartilage attaches to 8, and 10's cartilage attaches to 9. So these three ribs are called vertebrochondral ribs. And hopefully you remember from our study of the skeletal system that the term chondro is referring to cartilage. So these are ribs that run from the vertebra to the cartilage of a different rib. Ribs 8, 9, and 10. And then that brings us to the last two ribs, ribs 11 and 12. And these are simply known as vertebral ribs. No anterior attachment. These are sometimes called floating ribs. So no anterior connection, but again, they are attached to the vertebra. So you can see all three types of ribs have vertebra in their name, and then either include or don't include the anterior attachment. So this is the rib cage as a whole. Now, before we can see exactly how the rib attaches, we need to look at ribs themselves. So here is a picture of an individual rib. Now, you can see here a typical rib from the 3rd through the 9th. The ones above that, 1 and 2, sort of have a more odd shape. The floating ribs, the vertebral ribs at the bottom, the last few ribs are a little smaller. But these sort of ribs that are in the center of the rib cage are a little more alike and typical. So we're going to look at the various features that can be found on a single rib. And most of these features could be found on any rib, but they're just more obvious on these ribs here. So what are they? Well, look at the whole rib as a whole. The part that's closest to us is the posterior side, or the posterior end of the rib. This is the end that is attached to the vertebra itself. The rib sweeps away from us to the anterior end, and that would be the end that's toward the sternum. So starting here on the back, the first structure that attaches into the vertebra is the head of the rib. And this completely posterior end of the rib is the head of the rib. And of course, if you have a head, as the bone narrows, that's going to be the neck of the rib, and you can see that. And then the next little part on the rib is a lump, a tubercle. And hopefully you still remember that a tubercle is a lump or a bump. So these three features are very close together, and both the head and the tubercle are features that attach onto the vertebra itself. If you go a little bit beyond the tubercle, then you come to the angle of the rib. Notice that the rib gets wider at this point, and it also changes direction. From the head to the tubercle and over to the side, the rib is kind of running horizontally away from the vertebra. When the rib gets to the angle, it usually makes a distinct bend and then begins to turn forward toward the front of the rib cage. And so that angle can usually be identified both by it gets taller as it does, and if you've got a rib in your hands, you can usually see a distinct bend in the rib there. And then the rest of the rib as it goes forward is called the body of the rib. And along the body of the rib, along the inferior edge of the rib, is what is called the costal groove. Costal groove is a muscle attachment site. It's always on the inferior edge of the rib. And this is one of those features that could help you identify a right rib from a left rib. Most people get the head and the tubercle in the back. Most people get the position of the rib to sweep around the rib cage. But maybe you can imagine you could then turn the rib upside down or right side up and still have it look pretty much the same. But the costal groove then identifies the inferior edge. And when you put that edge down, you'll know if the rib you have is a left rib or a right rib. So it's sort of just a little groove or a little slot running along the inferior edge of the rib. And then you wind up at the distal or at the far end of the rib called the anterior end of the rib simply. So please be able to identify these various features on the rib. And here you can see, like on the tubercle, it's pointing to two little places. Don't worry about one or two. The tubercle is the bumpy place there. Even the head, that sort of shows you that there's two little spots on the head. Don't worry about those spots on the head. And I've just told you that the head and the tubercle are what attach onto the vertebra itself. So let's take a look at that. Let's see how the whole thing looks when you have a rib and a vertebra, the entire rib cage here. You can see the sternum in the front, but let's focus back here in the back on the vertebra and notice how both the right rib and the left rib have attachment sites onto the vertebra. So if you can pick out the head of either of those, then you can see where that's attached. And if you can pick out the tubercle on the ribs, you see where those are attached. And they sweep around like this. Notice at the anterior and the blue area there before the sternum is the cartilage that attaches the rib to the sternum. So let's look more closely then at where the rib and the vertebra anchor to one another. So here's a good image of that. And you can see now the vertebra very large. You can see the rib there. And if you look at those two red circles, you can see where the rib touches the vertebra. And the body of the vertebra is one place where the rib is attached, and the transverse process is the other place where it's attached. And notice which features are attached to which. So it's the head of the rib that's attached onto the body. And the body of the vertebra is actually going to have a little facet there, a little spot on the body where that head of the rib fits into. And then if you look at the other attachment site, you notice that the tubercle of the rib is what fits into a facet on the transverse process of the vertebra. So we're not going to really make a big deal about the facets on the rib itself, but as we look at a thoracic vertebra, we want to be able to identify the articular facet for the head of the rib, where the head attaches, and the articular facet for the tubercle of the rib on the transverse process. Let's look at that a little more closely here. Here is one of those thoracic vertebrae. And you can see here, here's the articular facet for the head of the rib, right here. And here's the articular facet for the tubercle of the rib. So there are times when I'm pointing here and people get confused. They think I'm pointing to the transverse process. I'd point really to the other side of the bone to get you to say that. If I'm pointing into a little facet, you should be able to tell whether it's one or the other. Notice also, if you look where the facet is for the head of the rib, right below it, there's a little facet. And one of the things you should know in case you look at other resources, I don't make a big deal about this, but other people make a big deal about this, and I think it becomes sometimes a little confusing, but sometimes a rib doesn't attach just directly to the body with its head. Sometimes the head actually anchors between two vertebrae. Let me show you a picture what that would look like. So here is a rib that's not attached only to the body of one vertebra. Notice how it fits in between two vertebrae. And I've just seen these little half facets where a rib hits between two vertebrae, called demifacets. Sometimes they're called superior demifacets or inferior demifacets. And all of that language gets fairly complicated. I just want us to focus on the fact that the head of the rib attaches into somewhere onto the body of one or two vertebrae. And the tubercle of the rib always attaches into the transverse process of the vertebra. And you can see that clearly in that little second picture that I showed. See how the tubercle is fitting right into the transverse process on that vertebra. So this is how they fit. The transverse process are important anchoring site. These are the vertebrae with the largest transverse processes because of the need to anchor that vertebra against, or that rib against the vertebra. Probably be wise for you to go back and look at the vertebral notes or the vertebral lecture and make sure that these two features are very obvious to you. Okay, and then that brings us to the last bone here, the sternum at the front. Has no bony attachments up except up there where the clavicle are. Every rib is attached into the sternum. Every rib that is attached to the sternum is attached by way of cartilage. The sternum is a single bone, but it's jointed. So it's got 3 pieces and 2 joints. The manubrium is the superior piece, sort of a trapezoidal piece with the clavicles attached to it. The main body of the sternum is sort of the blade-like piece. And then at the inferior end is the little rounded xiphoid process. So this is the structure of the sternum. And all in all, there's the rib cage, 3 types of ribs, various features on the ribs, especially the features that attach into the vertebra, and the sternum here in the front. So study well, and I'll see you in class.